Hello and welcome to this training session on Datastage. Today we are going to do a project implementation of the SCD dimension. SCD is slowly changing dimension. We are going to implement the type 2 of the slowly changing dimension. So we'll understand what SCD2 is first and then we'll try and make a job to implement it. Now the dimension that we're going to work with today is the employee dimension. I have the data of the employee file, employee dimension in front of me in the notepad. So first let us look at the structure of the employee dimension. We have a column called the employee number. We have a column called the first name, last name, hire date, band, department ID, start date, end date, and employee ID. Now since this is the employee dimension, what is the business key of this dimension? What identifies a unique employee? So a unique employee is identified by a unique employee number. So this makes it the employee number column, the business key. Now what is a type 2 dimension? Let's say that tomorrow the band of this employee changes from 5 to 6. Then what should happen to the data in this dimension? In type 2 dimensions, the history of the records, the history of the data is retained. So the history of this employee needs to be retained. That means we want this record, the previous record with band 5 for the employee A02, as well as the new record with band 6 for the same employee A02. Now if employee number is my primary key of this table, how can I have two records with the same employee ID, employee number, or the same primary key? That is why we need to have a surrogate key. Now this column here, the employee ID column, is the surrogate key for this dimension. This is unique for each record in this dimension. So how type 2 will work is, now if I have a new record with band 6 for the same employee number, a new record will be inserted in the dimension. The old record will be end dated. That means the end date of the record will be updated with the start date of the new record. The start date of the new record could be the transaction date, the status change date, or the current date for the new record. For the active record, the end date would always be the maximum end date. So this is a way to identify which is the active record. So your end date is 9999/12/31. That means this identifies that this is my current record. Now let's see what is the data that is coming to us for each batch run. The data that will be coming every time for the run would be in this format. It would be an incremental data. It would have the employee number column, first name, last name, department, hire date, band, and transaction date. Now this is a file that you'll be getting from your source. So you need to do some validations on this data. You need to validate this data. And then you need to load this data to your dimension. So now all these records, you can see that there are some of the employee numbers which we could see already existing in the dimension data. So what should happen to these records? If any of these column values has changed for that employee number, a new record should be inserted in the dimension table. So now let us design a job and see how this will work. So let's go and first open a new parallel job window. And then let's start defining our sources. So since our data is in the form of text files, we need the sequential file stage. Now this sequential file stage I'm going to use for reading the incremental or batch data. And I'm going to use another sequential file stage which I'm going to use for my dimensional data. Now I do not want to be hard coding because in real life projects will never be hard coding. So let's define some job parameters. Let's click on the job properties tab, and when the job properties dialog box comes up, let's go to the parameters tab and define the job parameters. So now we need to follow some naming conventions. So let's do that. Let's first define the path. So p_file_path. Let's define the file names. So file name for employee incremental data. and file name for dimension employee data. Let's define the default values. The path is temp. The employee incremental file name is test emp increment.txt, and the dimension name is, now it's dim underscore employee dot text. So we'll keep on adding more parameters as and when we use more stages. For us till this point, these three parameters are sufficient. Now let's configure my sequential file, my source file for the incoming data, for the batch data, for the incremental data. My file, let me define in terms of parameters. So let me just click on the button here. Let me go to insert job parameter. Let me select my file path and the file name. The file name is incremental. This is my file name. I need to define my format. So my delimiter is tab. My code is none. Right. Let me define my columns. So I'll not be typing in my columns. I am having my table definitions. So let me go and select the table definition. So this is the stream for my incoming data or the batch data or the incremental data. So every day for each employee number, records would not be coming to you for updating. Only those records will be coming for which some data has changed. So we have the employee data, and this, I think this should be our data. Let's look at it. Okay, so this is our data. Let's just say okay. So these are our columns. We do not need runtime column propagation, so let's not do that. Let's just come out, say okay. Okay, now one more thing, because we are trying to implement a project requirement, we have to be careful of the small things as well. For example, the naming conventions. This is sequential, sorry, employee incremental. Let me rename the link as well. Link input employee increment. Now this is going to my employee data, the dimension data. Let me again use my job parameters. We go to file path and let me choose the parameter for the file name. So this is my employee file. Let me set the delimiters, tab, code as none. Let me go to columns and load my data from the table definitions again. So this is my dimension data. So the first step that we are trying to do here is read the data for my batch load or the incremental data. Read the data that is already existing in my dimension table, and I'll try to implement a join to find out which records already exist, which employee number records already exist in my table, in my dimension table. And I'll pull out the employee ID from the dimension table, and you'll see why. So let's first go to the processing category. So let's implement the job, and then I'll explain to you why we have used all these stages and why we have designed like this. Let's pull the join stage. Now, since I would need to know which employee numbers already existed for which I have got the new incremental records, and I need to know the employee ID, the surrogate key, right? Why? I'll tell you. Okay, so let's first click on here on the join. What is the key column that we're going to join on? Employee number, obviously. Employee number. Do I want an inner join? No, I do not want an inner join because in my incremental data, probably some new employees have joined. So I've got some new employee records as well. I want all the records from my incremental data. Let me make sure that my incremental data is my left right. Yeah. Now you can see since I renamed it, I can understand what it means. But for the right link, I have not renamed it. That's not a good practice. So let me go back. Let me first name the stage properly. Okay, and dim underscore employee is my name, and let me, instead of connecting this directly, let me do it through a copy stage because I will be needing this data again. So let me use a copy stage. Let's go back here, use a copy stage, and copy stage will also make sure that we only take the relevant columns for the join. We do not need all those columns for the join. So this can be named as link dimension employee. Put it here. The copy stage can be named as copy dim employee. Let me go to the output tab of the copy stage and take only the columns that I need. Now for the purpose that I'm doing this comparison, I only need the employee number column on which I'll be joining to find out whether there is a pre-existing record in the dimension table, and if there is a pre-existing record, I want to know what is the employee ID or the surrogate key of that record. So I just want two columns for now. So let me just take two. Now this is again link. This is also an input link coming from dimension employee. Let me again go back to my join stage. So it's opened on the stage name. So let me take this chance to rename this correctly. This is join on employee number. All right. So we are going to join on the employee number because I want to check whether there is an already existing record in the dimension table for the same employee number. And I want to take all the records from my incremental link which is my left link, because there might be new records or new employees which might have been added. I want to make sure that I take all those records to the output. So I'll change this to left outer. Then I'll go to my inputs tab. Since this is a join, I need to be sure that I do a hash and sorting because this is a must requirement for a join. This needs to be done on the column on which we are going to make the join. So this is the employee number column. Make sure that you do it on both the input links because this is where sometimes you'll forget this is not employee ID. So just remove it. This is where you need to be careful. Let's say, okay, let's go to the output tab and let's take all the records that we need. Now I used a copy stage already, so I only have the records which I needed from the dimension, which were my employee ID. So I have one attribute coming from the dimension, all the other are coming from my main source link, which is what I needed. So I now know what is the employee ID of that record. Okay. So now I am done with the join. I know which records existed. Since this was a left outer join, if the employee ID I have taken from the reference link or the right link, if the value in the employee ID is null, that means that employee did not exist previously in the dimension table. Now what is my next requirement? My next requirement is, okay. Now, since this is a type 2 dimension, what would be my next requirement? My next requirement would be to see that which are the new records, which are the old records. I need to check that, right? Now, for checking that, so one thing I already know, and that is that there are few records which already existed in my dimension employee table. If there is any output from this join link, that means that there were few records that already existed in that dimension table, right? Now, probably there were few records which already existed in the dimension table for the same employee number, but I got those records in the source today, but there was no change to the attribute values. Then what do I need to do? In that case, I do not need to do anything. So now, using the join operation, I found out that there are some records that already existed in the employee table, but I still want to make sure whether there was any update to those records which already existed in the employee table and which today I have got from the source file. So to make that comparison, we are going to use another stage called the CDC stage. Okay. Now before that, let's use a transformer. Let's try to implement some other logic as well. So let's go and use a transformer. Put a transformer here. This is my transformer. We are going to implement a small logic here. We are going to derive a start date and the end dates. Let me just double click on this again. And I want all the links coming from my source taken as it is to the output. So now I have two date columns here, the transaction date and the hire date. The hire date column I need in my dimension. The transaction date column did not exist in the dimension, but what existed was the start date and the end date. So now let me convert them to those columns. Let me write some logic to derive those columns. So let me add another row for the end date column. Define the SQL type as date, the labelability as yes. So now I have two columns. What do I want in my start date column? Now my start date means the date from which this record was active. So what I want to do in this case is that if this is the first record, that means it never existed in the dimension before, then I want to put the hire date as my start date. But if this is not my first record, then I want to put transaction date as my start date. So what I need to do, my first condition is an if this is a new record, right? If this is a new record, that is, it did not exist before in the dimension, then what I need to do, I need to check for the null. So if is null, which column? The column that came from the right link or the dimension. So if is null employee ID, then what do I want to do? I want to put my input column. Which input column? If it is null, that means it did not exist in the dimension. Then I want to put my hire date. Else, if it is not null, then what do I want to put? I want to put my transaction date. This is my transaction date. What do I want to put in my end date? My end date I want to put, for now, I want to put as the maximum date. And we'll change the logic again later on. We'll derive the logic. But for now, I want to put the maximum date that I put. So that is a variable. So what I'll do, I'll use a function. I'll go to type conversion. I'll use the function string to date and give that maximum value as the date here, as a string input to this. So that was in the format 99991231. So this is now my end date. Okay. Now what should be the next part of this job? What should we do next? We have derived some logic in the transformer for the start date and the end date. Now we still want to check which records have been updated, which records are new records to be inserted. All those checks need to be made still. So for that, we are going to use a new processing stage called the change capture stage. That is a processing stage, and that can identify which records are new records and which record are update records. So let's use this. Now it's always advisable to separate the update records and the insert records. Make the update first dimension and then go for the insert records. So as a best practice, we need to isolate or separate the update records from the insert records. Make the update first and then the insert. Now this is a change capture stage. This needs two inputs. It basically compares your before image to your after image and identifies which columns are based on your before and after image. It will identify which columns which records need to be updated in your before image, which records need to be inserted in your before image, which records have been deleted from your before image. So again, it needs two inputs. It needs an input from my dimension as well. So that's why I had used a copy stage. Now I have provided it two inputs, but I need to again name it properly. So this is link dim employee. Okay, so this name already exists. So let's rename again. Link dim employee change capture. Now let's go back to the transformer. We have not followed the naming conventions, and this will not be a good job design. So let's follow the naming conventions. Transformer and start date. Okay. We have not renamed this link, so link to transformer. Okay, this is my primary increment link. So link increment employee. Now let's click on the change capture stage and see what can be interpreted through the change capture stage. Now this I'm basically using to identify which are my insert records, which are my update records. I do not need to identify which are my delete records, because there might be many records for many employees which are not present in my source data for today, because there had been no update made to those records. So we're not going to identify which are delete records. It can also identify which records are truly copy records, which means which have come in today's data but no attribute value has changed for them. But how does it do all this? It needs to have some criteria defined. It does not by default go and check all the attributes and all the keys. It needs to know a key based on which it will identify whether it is a unique record or a duplicate record. Now this key is obviously for us the employee number. Now we can't see anything coming in here because from the other link, we have not propagated anything. So let's go to the copy stage, go to the other output link of the copy stage. What columns do we need? We need the employee number columns. What other columns do I need to compare? See, the first name, the last name, the hire date. These columns are never going to change their values. Your first name, last name might change, but let's assume for our project that they will not change. The hire date cannot change, it will remain the same. So again, because we're taking a simple situation, it might happen that an employee was an employee earlier as well. He left the company and then rejoined the company. So the hire date in that case might change. He might be assigned the same employee number, but we are trying to keep it simple. So we will assume that the first name, the last name and the hire date will not change. What might change is your band, and what might change again is your department ID. These are the two columns that might change. I do not need the start date and end date. I already have the employee ID coming from the other link, so I do not need that. Now, one thing that we have missed here is that the data that we are getting from the source is the department name. It's not department ID. From the source, you will not be getting a department ID, because the ID is a column that you have generated for your own for your own data warehousing system. So your source system is an external application. They will not know what is the ID and what it means. So what we need to do is, before going to the change data capture stage, we need to do another lookup. So let's do that another lookup. Let's take it a little away. We need to do a lookup on a department lookup table. Since it has a very less number of data, we are going to use a lookup stage in this case. So let's go and to the processing category. Let's pull out a lookup stage and put it over here. Now lookup stage, I need to have my department data as well. So let me take the sequential file again here and connect it as a reference link here. Now let me go back to my job properties, define the name of my department lookup file as well. So again, following the naming conventions, this is file name, department, and the file name is test underscore department dot text. Let's say okay. Let me click here. Again, insert the parameters, insert job parameter. We have the file path, and then we are going to insert the job parameter for the file name. So here is the file name. The format, let's go and define the format as well. The delimiter is going to be tab. The code is going to be none. Let's define the columns. We can also load the table definition, which is a good practice. But since there are just 2 columns, I'm just going to type them in here. And department name, which would be a varchar column. Length would be 20. Nullability would be yes. Alright. And let me take an input link out of this. Now let me give it a proper name. This is link reference department. And let me give here also a proper name. To the stage, let's go back to the stage, give it a proper name, which is a sequential reference department. Okay. Let's click on a lookup stage. Now since this is all the proper length names, it will be easy for us to identify. This is reference, this is increment. What do I want to do a join on? On my department name, because I want to pull out the department ID. So let me take the department and drag it to the department name column. Make it a key field. Now this is my join is defined. Let me not forget to change this lookup failure to continue, because I do not want to drop the record which fails it. I want to identify it later on. Let me just say okay. Now I want all the columns from my input link to propagate through, and I want the department ID column from here. So I'll take the department ID column from here and I'll drop the department column, because I don't need this anymore. So I'll just delete this column from here. Yes. Okay. So this is done. So now I define my lookup stage. Again, I've forgotten to name it properly. So I'll name it as lookup department. Let's go here to the properties, give it a proper name, lookup on department. Okay. Now I have the department ID and I'm ready to compare my data with the already existing data. So let me click it here. This is my output link. This needs to be named. This is the name for this link. So this is link lookup data. Now let me go to the change capture stage. Name it first properly. Change capture employee dimension. what is going to be my change key. So my change key is obviously the business key, because that will decide whether it will be a duplicate for the table based on the business key or not. Okay, so I'm going to this is employee data, so obviously we are going to compare on the employee number column. We are going to identify if there are any records from the source for employee numbers which are already existing in the dimension table, or if there are new records for new employee numbers. These are the two things we are going to identify here. We can also identify using this stage if there are any records for the employee numbers which are present in the dimension table, but none of the attributes has changed. So this also we'll identify, and we can also see if there are employee numbers which do not exist any longer, which do not come in the source data but exist in the dimension table. So this it can identify as a delete. So if you have a full set of data and you want to identify your deletes, if you have a full set of employee numbers coming every day, then you can identify your employee numbers which have been deactivated or deleted. But we're not going to do that. The only thing we need to identify is employee numbers which already existed in the dimension table. For those employee numbers, one, has any of the attribute value changed? If it has changed, we need to identify it as an update record. If it has not changed, we need to identify it as a copy record, or we need to just silently drop that record. Third that we need to identify, third thing that we need to identify is if there are any employee number records coming from the input which are new records which never existed in the dimension. So those will be identified as insert records. So our key value here is going to be the employee number column, and we have just one key value. We can define all these other attributes as well, whether it has to be case sensitive, null position, what would be our sort order. So we'll just leave it, it's all to default, and our key is employee number. Now look at the second option value that you need to provide, the change values. This means, do you want to compare all the attributes for changes, or do you want to just limit a number of, you want to compare a set of attributes? So you have to define, even if you want to compare all of them, we'll have to define all of them in these values. So if you click on value, you can see and go to the drop down, you'll see it will give you the names of all the columns which exist commonly in both the links, both its input links. Since from the copy stage you only propagated the columns for which we were expecting changes, it is only showing us all those three columns. So department ID, we expecting changes. So we'll define one of the attributes that needs to be checked for change in value as department ID. What is the other attribute that needs to be checked for change in value? The band might change of the employee, so the band. So now we've defined the change key based on which it will try to identify whether it's a new record or an update record or what kind of record it is. And we have identified the change values or the attribute columns for which it will try to see whether there have been any updates to that column. Now let's come to the options and see what it says. Change mode, explicit keys and values, because we have explicitly defined them. Drop output for copy, true. So if there are any records employee numbers which exist in the today's data as well as in the dimension data, but the values for department ID and band have not changed, they will be identified as copy records. Do you want to drop them or do you want to propagate them? I want to drop them, so let's just put this as true. Drop output for delete, false. So I do not want to recognize the delete records as well, so I'll as well drop them. So let me say true. Drop output for edit. Now edit is any record for which these two values have changed of the attributes for the same employee number record. So I do not want to drop that, I want to identify it. So edit is like an update record. Drop output for insert, false. I do not want to drop it for the insert. Log statistics is okay, false. Okay, so I am just going to identify these two kind of records, edit records which are update records and the insert records. Now let's go to the link ordering. This is very important. What is my before link and what is my after link? So my before link is a dimension data, right? You need to be sure of this because both the links that are coming to the change capture stage, you can see here, they are not like dotted lines or anything. They are both similar looking lines. So you need to make sure what is a before link and what is your after link. Otherwise everything will be different, right? So my before link is the dimension link. This is my after link. This is the new data that I am trying to insert into this table. Now let's go to the output and let's try to map the records. So let's map all the records that we want, right? Now you can see that all the records are coming from my new data link, right? And there is one new column that has been added by default, which is the change code. Now this change code will have some numeric values in it like 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4, and these will identify whether it's an edit record or a delete record or an update record or an insert record or a copies record. So you need to understand, you need to know what these values mean to identify the correct records. Now 1 is your insert record, 3 is your update record, okay? So we'll re-verify whether these are the correct values or not. But the change code value will have all these codes which will help us to identify whether it is a new record or it is an update record. Now once we have the new record and the update record with us, what do we want to do? Let's take another transformer. Let's go to the processing category and take another transformer. So now I have identified which are going to my update records and which are going to be my insert records. So that is the main thing that I wanted to identify. So let me take out two output links of the transformer. One will be going as my update records. So let me just rename it. Link out update. And one will be going to my insert records. Link out insert. And this is the link coming from my change capture. Link out change capture. Now let me double click on the transformer stage and see how this is going to work. So that we remember that there was a new column that was added called the change code column. We need to use that column now. So what we need to do is, this is our update link, this is our insert link. In the update link, I want my employee number. Do I want my employee number in the update link? I do not want my employee number in the update link. I just want my employee ID, right? So we are not just segregating the update records and the insert records. Now the update records that the change data capture stage would have identified would be based on the employee number. But what we are actually trying to implement with the transformer here is the actual records that need to be updated in my dimension table. Now for that I already know the employee ID of the already existing record in my dimension table. I would update based on the employee ID. What I need to update for that employee ID record, which already exists in the dimension table. I need to update the end date of that record. I would need to end date the record for the same employee number which already existed. I do not want to identify it using the employee number, because there might have been this is just the second time that we're running the job. Let's say I run it the third time and there's again an update on the on some of the parameter value, and there's a third record that gets inserted for the same employee number. So we cannot use the employee number to identify it, but the previous record needs to be updated or end dated. So the employee ID that we have already pulled using the join stage in the very first join that we use, that employee ID needs to be used to identify the record that needs to be end dated in the table. And that is the only record technically that needs to be updated in the dimension table. So I pulled my employee ID, which I'll use as a key to update my table. But what do I need to update it with? I need to update my end date, right? I need to end date that record. I need to update it with my end date. Now the end date that would be there would be the maximum end date of as of today, because that was the latest active record as of today. But now I have new data coming in for the same employee number. So this record needs to end as of today. So what should be my end date now? My end date should be the start date of my new record. And I've already used the transformer earlier to calculate the start date, right? My start date was either the higher date if it was a new record, now in this case we already know it is not a new record, it is an update record. So in that case it was the transaction date. So the end date now will become the transaction date of the new record or the start date of the new record. So we'll see once we look at the data, you will have a better understanding. Now for the update or the insert link, this was for the update link. What do I need to define for my insert link? What columns do I want? For my insert link, I need to know all the column values because I'm going to insert them. So I need to know all the column values. Let me just drag and drop and then I'll remove the columns that I don't need. I need all the columns here. I just don't need the change code. So I'll just delete it. And I cannot have an employee ID here, or let me just leave the employee ID for now. Or otherwise just remove it. Let's say delete, because the employee ID would come as null for these columns because it never existed in the dimension, so there won't be any values for those. Now define some different columns for the update link. I've defined some different columns for the insert link. How will the transformer identify which records should go to the update link, which record should go to the insert link? For that, the update link. Which are the update link records? Which records have been updated? The update link records are your any record with the change code of 3. So we'll re-verify this, but I think it's change code 3. So any record with the change code of 3 is an update record that the change capture stage would have identified. All the records identified as the update records need to be end-dated in the dimension table for that employee ID. So here I have it. Now what are my insert records? Now, ideally, if you see all the other records would be insert, any new records would be insert records, right? Any new records, if there are any new records for any new employee numbers. But those are not the only records that are getting inserted in the dimension table. This is step 2 dimension. There are also records that are getting inserted for the employee number that existed before, but then attribute has been changed. So these also would have been identified as updates by the change data capture stage. So in this case, I want my change code to be equal to 1 or my change code to be equal to 3, 1 or 3. 1 is an insert, that means new employee numbers, and 3 is again an update, that means employee numbers that already existed, but there has been some update made to some of the attribute. So a new record will be inserted for it with a new employee ID value. Let's just say OK and come out of this. Now what we can observe here is that for the update link, we already have identified the employee ID that needs to be updated. For the insert link, we still need to generate an employee ID, and that employee ID needs to be unique. So we'll do that, but before that, let's rename this transformer as well to a meaningful name. Let's just click here, transformer, update, insert. Okay. So for doing this, we need to have a surrogate key generator stage. Again, go to the processing category. This is your surrogate key generator stage. How this works is you can define a text file or a sequence from which it will read the values. You can define the output column name. So that is for us employee ID. What is your source name? Source name is your file name from which you are trying to read the values. So you can define a file like a test. I think I've defined it as cust. So I'll just define it as cust.sk, and let's see. Flat file. And okay, just a minute. Let me check the name of the SK file that I have defined. Okay. Okay, so it is test underscore employee. So this is just like a text file. You can just create a dummy file the first time you run your job and point your surrogate key generator stage to that file. So if let's say in your first run there are 10 records, this surrogate key will generate some 10 random values, but unique values for your surrogate key column, like the employee ID column that we have defined. The next time you run this job, the surrogate key file would have already, it would have the maximum value that it generated for the last run. It would have that written on it and all the values that it generated. So next time you run the job, it will again start creating some unique values. So it retains the information from your last run, and every time you run the job, it will always create unique values. So that is why you should go for a surrogate key stage to make sure that every time there's a unique value that is created. Now source is a flat file, generate key from last highest value, you can just leave it as no, because sometimes what will happen, it will generate based on the partition numbers. It will not generate in a sequential order. There might be gaps in between of key ranges which are available, so it can pick from anywhere, but it by its own, it will make sure that only unique ID values are generated. Let's go to the input. We don't need to do anything. We can just drag and drop it to the output, and you will see that there is a new column that gets generated, surrogate key generator employee ID. And employee ID is the name that we gave to this. Now let's go back to the file stage and attach some data sets so that we can know what kind of data will come. So let's go here, let's attach a data set over here. Let's attach a data set over here as well. Let's go back to a job parameters tab and give make some, let's say, okay, so 1 second. Okay, so this is our job properties dialog box. Let's go back to the parameters tab and let's generate some parameters for the data sets. So P, DS, this is what, employee underscore update, let's say. Okay, let's keep it all caps only. Update and PDS underscore employee underscore insert. Let's give some default values. DS underscore employee underscore insert dot DS, right? Because it's a data set. And DS underscore employee underscore insert dot DS. Okay, let's say okay. Let's give the remaining names. So this is link out insert DS. Let's give a proper name to the surrogate key generator stage. Escape is okay, which column, for which column, employee ID. Okay, let's rename this as well as data set out employee update, and let's call this as well. Okay, we need to define the names as well, which we have not defined. So ds underscore out underscore employee underscore insert. Let's go to the input tab, define the file, define it by the job parameters. So file path, click outside, and the ds name, this is for insert. Okay, let's click here, let's define the file again. So this would be your file path, and then this would be your update file. Okay, so now we are done with the job.